To start, I would love if you could just give a sort of quick introduction of yourself, your name, your title, and then a little bit about your background and experience.
I'm Dennis Bergeson. I'm currently the Senior Vice President of Supply Chain at a large consumer goods company. Got over 40 years experience in operations and supply chain across multiple industries and verticals.
The first thing I really wanted to understand from you, given that extensive experience, is sort of what operational excellence means to you. When you hear that, what does that represent for you?
Yeah, the key word in what I'm about to say will be discipline. So it's a disciplined use of tools and principles really to enhance and improve organizational outcomes and results. So, discipline, process, outcomes, and results. And it's all based on a continuous improvement mindset.
What do you think the biggest challenges are that sort of get in the way of organizations being able to have that disciplined approach?
A couple things come to mind. One is having the full team pulling in the same direction at the same time. That becomes a big challenge. And even slight misalignment can create tremendous friction in the organization, right? And I think about not in the world of business, but in other sporting world, where it's the difference between winning and losing. And a couple examples come to mind, like 8-man crew in rowing. They just have to be perfectly aligned, and all their training, all their education, all their practice. One little misalignment and that boat's just not moving perfectly. Or a pit crew in a Formula One race where tenths of a second matter. So those are extreme examples. You can think about how misalignments can really cause a lot of problems in a industrial or commercial environment, which is again where the discipline comes in. And I think it brings a second piece to it. That's why your processes have to have continual checking of where you are, so that any misalignment that you have the opportunity to bring it back together before you get too far out of alignment, so to speak, right? And
Mhm.
so that's an element of it. I think that another challenge, and I'm going to say this in a bad way because I'm an older person, I do think there's a generational aspect to what I'm going to talk about. And it's the difference between education and training. And so I think we train a lot of people out in the workforce, and I don't think we educate them very much. And I think that happened in a big way when ERP systems began to become prevalent in the workforce. We trained a lot of people how to use the tool, but we didn't educate them on what was really going on. And so the bad analogy I use for that is we have a lot of people that know how to use calculators that really don't understand math. I think that's another challenge on the workforce is people don't understand the full flow and how things need to fit. And so when things get out of alignment, sometimes you can't tell.
I guess with those sort of challenges in mind, how does someone like you, a leader in your position, sort of think about ensuring that folks aren't just sort of trained on the tools, but as you put it, they really understand everything behind what has to happen? How do you go about tackling that as a leader?
Yeah, I think engagement becomes important, right? Being present and being engaged with the workforce is important, and keeping score is important of the things that matter, not just keeping score for the heck of it. But when engagement, often people talk about one element of engagement is communication, and we want to improve communication. Too often, I think leaders also, when they say that, what ends up happening is there's a increase in the one-way flow of information out, but what people are really asking for is to be heard. And so being able to listen to the voice of the people doing the work instead of telling them what we think they want and need to know is a balance that is not often struck well.
That's super interesting. I love the framing of sort of when people say communication is the gap. The takeaway is, oh, we have to communicate more versus we need to take in what they're trying to tell us through all these different channels and
Right.
signals. Curious then too, just to sort of transition a bit, because I think that's a nice bridge into this sort of discussion around frontline leaders and
Yeah.
leadership development in particular. What, I guess generally in that sort of flow of communication and in that sort of role of being really present in the workforce, how do you look at your frontline leaders or that leadership team that sits underneath you and what role they play?
Yeah, a few things tend to happen, and I don't think it's just at my company. I think it's at many companies. And I've certainly seen it at companies I've worked for. I don't think we place the importance on the frontline supervisor as often as we need to. We place the importance on that next level manager instead. Not to say that that's not important, but we overlook that frontline supervisor. That's the person that touches the most employees on a everyday basis. That's the person that's closest to the product or service we're selling the customer from the management perspective. And often our criteria for who's going to be a good supervisor is who is a good operator, which is as not necessarily the most robust criteria. So we get what we get, right? But it's a critical role and we often underinvest in it as a result. And of course, we pay the consequences because of that.
I think that's a really interesting point. Oftentimes that frontline supervisor is the person that was a great operator and
Right.
now they move into this leadership role. How do you think that leaders should approach sort of providing that new frontline supervisor with the tools they need to become that great leader, not just that great operator who is now in charge of executing?
Yeah, I think that's a, a right question. I think it comes back to training and education to some extent. Often, when we put people in those roles, right, we train them on the administrative tasks they now have to complete. And we don't educate them on things like how to have good communication with, I'll use the word not in the DEI sense, but with a diverse workforce, right? We all communicate, we all hear, we all learn, we all do things differently. So, how do I communicate with that diverse team on the floor that comes with different backgrounds, different experiences, different ways of learning? How do we teach that person how to prioritize, how to make decisions, how to give coaching and feedback, constructive coaching and feedback, how to solve problems, how to resolve conflict? How do we educate people how to do that and not just send them to one class, give them a certificate that said you did it and move on? I think that's the difference between the training and the education, too, right? And so we're in this environment as a society in America for sure, where we just assume one and done and move on. I told you, kill it next. And these are people we're talking about. And so in our hustle and bustle and haste, we think, hey, I told you, what don't you get? And it's your problem. Well, the reality is it's my problem. So there's that mindset, right?
Completely. A lot of this is really resonating. I think you sort of touched on what seems like one of the biggest challenges comes back to is really tied to this challenge that confronts organizations who are striving for this operational excellence, which is this idea of these are people. And so they're going to have diverse needs and thoughts, and just training them on the sort of tasks that they need to do in order to complete their job is probably not enough in terms of actually
Right.
educating that workforce.
I don't want to come across as saying that we shouldn't have training for those tasks, right? That's absolutely important too, but I think we've over indexed on the training and under indexed on the education, if you will.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious too if you think there are other challenges sort of like this that organizations who are trying to develop the frontline supervisor. It's interesting that you've really called out as this really key critical role. Are there other challenges you see organizations have as they try to sort of develop frontline leaders, or where do you see organizations, or have you seen organizations sort of falling short of being able to up level these next generations of frontline supervisors?
Yeah, well, there's a related issue and it's broader than just in this context. Part of the reason, going back to what you and I talked about a minute ago around as a good operator, make a good supervisor. Well, there's a reason that's the path that often happens because the good operator, we want to reward them and promote them. And so the only place we have to promote them into is into a supervisor. And so we've built organizational structures that don't have, I'll say, advancement or promotional, if you want to call it that, paths for individual contributors to a point. So the only place to promote people is into management.
Mhm.
And that's not always the right thing. And so now you got people competing for, they want to get ahead, they want to make some more money, right? And so the second thing we as leaders have to figure out is, what are other ways we can reward and recognize people professionally that don't involve becoming a supervisor and a manager? When we figure that out, other things tend to happen well too, right? So I think there's an element of that. How did we get in this spot? Well, because that's what happens, right? That's the only way we have to recognize those people, and they're our best, so we should recognize them. Why don't we make them the supervisor? Because they'll be a lousy one, is the answer. you know. But at any rate, so that's an element of valuing our workforce and recognizing people are people too, right? Which again goes back to the how do we remain engaged and have good engagement.
Yeah, I love that idea that there are maybe these non-traditional structures or paths for folks who are your best operators who want a path forward, but it doesn't necessarily have to be management. And instead you can have
Right.
the criteria for managers that looks beyond just sort of rewarding or recognizing the great individual
Right.
contributor, looks at the broader leadership skill set.
I would say this on a personal level. I started my career a long time ago as an engineer. So in the engineering discipline, there are those paths. And so in highly technical areas, those kind of progressions, if you want to call it that, exist. So this isn't something that I'm some smart person sitting in an office came up with. This has been around for longer than me, and I've been around a while. I think it's just applying it to different areas than we may have traditionally applied it.
Are there other tactics you found? I love that idea of sort of saying there are these other ideas that exist that we could apply in different ways. Um, Curious if there are other tactics that you've seen or at other organizations where you felt like they've really figured it out and they really understand how to, or we really understand how to tactically create better leaders.
Yeah, so I have some experience, starts way back early in my career. It has to do with safety, but it's more broadly applicable. The company I worked for at the time had a problem with safety. They were improving their overall safety results, but when they had a problem, it was a big problem and it killed multiple people, kind of big problems. And so to solve that, they actually chartered some academic research around what causes these kind of things. And long story short, they came out with a toolkit that initially they kept internally, but now they've licensed it and it's available to anybody. You got to pay for it, but it's licensed and available to anybody. And it's called the Hearts and Minds Toolkit, and it's licensed through someone in the UK, which I could talk to you about on another day. But it's a set of 10 tools around getting to people's hearts and minds to have an intrinsically safe workplace. And with the belief that, again, it's not safety training, it's safety culture, impacting the culture and getting to where it's intrinsic safety, not extrinsic safety. And one of the 10 tools in there, because they recognize the key, is improving supervision. And these were industrial psychologists that built it. And I've met them. So I actually understand a little of how they got here because we use this at one of my subsequent workplaces. And I'd like to say it had an impact. But at any rate, I think, again, that you could get exposed to, here's this toolkit. How could we integrate something like that, which includes this tool called improving supervision that really recognizes the role of the frontline supervisor in the culture on the front line. And that's what drives the performance safety or otherwise, on the front line. And so it's got some other fascinating tools in the kit, but again, recognizing that and some tools around how do we improve supervision.
Yeah, and I love what you said about sort of making it intrinsic as opposed to extrinsic, which is
Yeah,
I feel like that's a really recurring theme is just this idea
yeah,
that it can't be at the surface level. It
right,
can't go through the motions. It has to be like you understand why you're doing what you're doing and you believe in why you're doing what you're doing, whether that's creating a better safety culture or learning how to provide constructive feedback to your
right.
director.
Well, I think if you tie it back to your where you started, you can maybe be operationally competent and you may have bursts of operational, what look like operational excellence when it's extrinsic. But until that discipline and that culture becomes intrinsic, you have no prayer of having operational excellence in any sustainable way. Again, you may get a short burst, but no sustainable way unless and until you have that. So I think that's what makes those things powerful and important. Operational excellence, it's that culture mindset. Eliminating waste is another way to think of it. As part of it, continuous improvement, eliminating waste. I do think this education versus training thing is a broader issue in the workplace today. And again, I think communication is as much about listening as giving. So those are some key points to me.
I have so many pages of notes based on this conversation. Dennis, I so appreciate it. It was really fascinating to hear you speak, and I feel like a lot of what you said will really resonate with folks that we talk to, and I'm just really excited about the conversation.
Great.
Really
Well, it's my pleasure.